So today is the CSS class of this series on web development. CodePen is a free web IDE, integrated development environment, just a website to write and execute code on it, aka HTML, CSS, and next week JavaScript. So if we've all opened up this page, we can see this is what this looks like. It's a little bit like what Replit looks like. We can see we have the output. We have an output, and then we have an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript kind of pane tab, just like this. In Replit, we knew that actual websites, the content, the style, and the JavaScript, those come in individual files. But in CodePen, each of these symbolizes a file. We can think of this as an HTML file. This is a styles.cs file, and this is a JavaScript file. It just looks less like a little file button, like on Replit, than just kind of being built into the page itself like this. So we can go ahead. You can go ahead and tidy up how you want to make it viewable. I'm going to hide JS, that's JavaScript, and I'm going to hide CSS, and we'll just look at HTML in the beginning. But you can size these panes as you want just by pulling on it like this. Just a couple things about CodePen to begin. Last week we did HTML, and we know that in HTML, we wanted to keep, if we go back to Replit, we kept most of the content that was visible on the page inside that body element. In CodePen, we can assume everything inside the HTML box is inside the body element. So we can just put anything that would be in the body inside this box, and we can skip the body itself, and we can also skip kind of the code that you need to describe the whole page as an HTML document. So we can just think of ourselves at this point in an HTML file. That's the spot on the page. CodePen, the reason we'll be using it today is CodePen updates automatically. So as you type, it automatically updates the page. So as we type and change things, it's just going to be quickest on us to see the changes on the page. And that's the main reason why we didn't use Replit, because we constantly had to click the run button and wait on it to load up like that. So that's the main reason why we want to use CodePen. It updates automatically, and as you make any changes, sometimes you might have to click the save button and wait on it to change. Might just be the Wi-Fi. But that's the main reason. And also on CodePen, we noticed that we don't have the ability like we do on Replit to have multiple HTML pages. In CodePen, we just kind of have one web page. We have one trio of an HTML, a CSS, and a JavaScript file / pane, what have you. So that's what we have with CodePen. So what is CSS? So CSS is a language, just like HTML was a language that we got taught last time, and it's used to style HTML elements. Without it, all web pages would just look like black text on a white background. Anything visually based, anything style, anything paint and stuff like that, layout, is CSS. So if we take a look at a page like the library website, we can see all this kind of spacing. This is all CSS, the font choice, that's CSS. The kind of layout of this being in the middle, this being off to the side, all of this is CSS because it's all visually based. If I use a little magic and remove the CSS on this page, we can see that without CSS, it is just black on white text with a couple exceptions that just kind of slip through what I just did. But you can see without CSS, you just kind of have text on a page. You just go all the way down. This is that same web page we just saw. And then we have, some giant images that we haven't used CSS to size. We see the text just kind of as plain as can be, rows of images, icons way too big. So this is kind of what a page looks like without CSS. So even though CSS is technically optional, if you don't want a web page to look like this, and you want it to look nice and well designed. All of this comes from CSS. So that's what we'll be looking at today. And again, keeping in mind, HTML, nothing visual. It's all about meaning and what something is. Is something a navigation? Is something defined as a link? Is it a P element, a paragraph? Things like that. HTML has actually no style associated with it at all. Things like Chrome and Mozilla and Edge and all those things, when you load a web page, what it's actually doing is it's giving some default, really basic skimped down CSS to common things like H1s and H2s, P elements, A's, A tag, which is a link. It just kind of gives a default CSS ruling to all of those. Just to have some kind of consistency in case the people who make the website don't apply anything when they load up the page. CSS itself can be in a couple places. If we look to the left, this is an image I stole out of, it's just a screenshot of replit.com actually. And we can see in it the 3 places that CSS can be. One is, it's called an inline style attribute. We talked about attributes last time. It's something that goes, if we look at this H1, it's something that's inside the opening tag of an element itself. So we can just see I have an H1, which the text of is just heading, but inside of it we have an attribute style, and it's going to make that heading come out in green like that. So that's an inline style attribute. That's the most simple way to place it. You just tie it right to the element itself. The next way, kind of one step up in complexity and usefulness, is what's called like page level CSS. And it's actually its own element. Just like we have the element H1 and A and P and body, we have an element style. And when we open and close that, in between that, we can write what we'll be doing a lot of today, which is some CSS. So we can see, we'll explain what this kind of syntax is in a couple minutes, but we can kind of guess. It looks like I'm doing something with H1, and then I'm specifying a font size. Let's make it 26 pixels. And what that is this page level. So this is going to be all the way at the top of some HTML page. It's not in its own CSS file. It's just at the top of the HTML page in a style attribute. In a style element. It's usually going to be in the head with all that metadata. And we can put all the CSS, selecting all the elements on the page in the style element. And then the last place CSS can be, and the most useful, is its own CSS file. So we can see this is something we saw last time, but we didn't use. We have this link element. It's saying it's the file style.css. Its relation is it's a style sheet to this HTML document. And the type is it's just saying it's a CSS document. So if we go to Replit, this is the sheet we did last time. And if we look up in the head, we have the style element. And this we did at the end of last class. We selected table and did some stuff to that. Same with the table data and table heading. And then up at the top, this style link element is basically saying, look to a file called style.css, which is this guy, and pull any CSS, which will look exactly like this from this style sheet, and apply it to the web page. This is blank, so nothing is being pulled from it. But today in CodePen, we'll basically be mimicking that outside style sheet. We can think of as an outside style sheet, and we can put in CSS to this to combine with the HTML and make some output on the web page. So we just saw this a little bit last time and just now again. How do we actually set up CSS? How do we write the syntax, write like a sentence of code in CSS? Well, it's actually quite simple. It's not too bad at all. What you see right now is basically what it kind of always looks like. It is always kind of this simple. And you only have to do two things. Thing one is you just have to select which element you want to style. So we can see again, someone is selecting H1, so they just typed out H1. And that means find any and all H1s on the web page and apply the following styles to it. So that's thing one, just select what you want to apply style to. And then B, the second thing you do, and you do it between these squiggly brackets to say, I'm choosing an H1, this is all I'm going to apply to it. And then when we see a closing bracket, that means, okay, I'm done applying style to H1. And then on the next line, maybe I can apply some styles to H2, to P tags, to links, things like that. So in between the squiggly brackets, then we kind of have some couples. And it's basically a two-bit thing. So we want to define what we'll be styling. So we might be defining the text color like this. We might be defining the font size. So we basically say which CSS rule I'm going to be making, what kind of style am I going to be applying. And then we have a colon, and we can see a colon following each of these. And then we have the value. And as you can see, the value is just what style will we actually be applying. So we want to say, okay, I'm going to do something about font size. What am I going to do? That's my value. It's going to be 12 pixels. So on the website, all H1s will come out as a font size of 12 pixels. And they'll also be in blue because I have two CSS declarations on this little line. So that's the basics of CSS syntax. Just like in HTML, we talked a little bit about bugs. In HTML, maybe if you didn't close an element, or maybe you missed the backslash on a close tag, you might get some bugs, and maybe you might not. It's the same thing with CSS. If you miss, an opening bracket, a closing bracket, if you miss a colon or a semicolon, the website's not going to crash, but you might just not see what you expect. If I missed this semicolon.
Maybe that's why she said 2 tablespoons or something. Just wet the whole thing.
Say again? Did someone say something? Okay. So if we make a small typo, it's not going to crash the website, but we might not see the fonts and the colors and things like that applied as we want it until we go back and fix the code, and then it'll be applied because Chrome, Mozilla, Safari will be able to correctly read the CSS that we defined. So it's a little finicky about like the punctuation and stuff like that, but it's not too bad. This we'll look at again and again, but this is just a list of what we'll be seeing. We just saw we can say let's select all H1 elements, but we can select beyond just the element level. So if we want an element, we can just name it. We can put H1, we can put P, but we can also use class names. And we talked a little bit about classes and IDs last time, and we'll talk about them again when we get to them in today's class. But a class in an ID was basically an attribute that you can give any element. It's basically some additional custom name that you give it so that you can, like today, group things and maybe apply style to a lot of things at once. And we'll see a lot of examples of this today. So we can select based on elements. We can select based on custom classes. If we want to give a class name to a couple things, maybe a couple Ps, maybe a couple H1s, and then we can just select the class name instead of applying a style to H1 and then separately applying the same style to P tag. We can use class names and things like that. And we can come back to this at the end of today and realize that we looked at all of these. We'll do all these in class today, so I'm just going to move on for now. But I just put it in so you can look back at it all in one place. So if we go ahead, and now we can go ahead and finally look at the CodePen site today. In the beginning, we talked about the multiple places we can put CSS, the inline style attribute, the page level CSS style element, and the outside CSS file. And we just want to talk about today at the beginning why we don't want to use the inline style like this. If we look at my HTML pane, I'll close out CSS. And this is the same as this image. Basically, what we can see is we've totally mixed HTML and CSS. All within what this image is the HTML file. So we've mixed them and we've lost a couple things. One, it's difficult to read. We have so much inline style. You can see the style equals float left. You can see style equals color black, text align, middle, padding, things we'll talk about today. But the point is it's taking up a lot of space and it's difficult to read this just HTML wise. So as we go along today, you'll see it's easiest to keep HTML and CSS separate. So that's why we use a separate CSS file. Or at the very least, we can use a page level CSS element in which we just have the style all in one place. And the last bad thing about inline CSS is we don't get to select which elements to apply style to. It's implicit because we put it inside the tag itself. So we can see we have an A tag and we have a style display block. The text is going to be black, aligned in the middle, and a couple of things besides that. But then if we look down at this second A tag, we see the same exact thing again, and then the same exact thing again. So if you do inline style, you have to repeat it as many times as you want to apply it. So I had, 5 links. I have to do the same exact code 5 times. With the CSS today, we only have to do anything once. So that's why we want CSS in its own place. It's easy to read. You only have to type it once. A lot of convenience comes with it. So let's go ahead and just type some basic examples so we get used to typing it out, seeing what it looks like, stuff like that. So go ahead and we can just close out HTML. We'll just look at CSS. Let me see if I can get this like this. And let's just do some examples. So I want to apply some styles to my links, my A elements. So what we do is we select step 1. So I'm going to select A, and then I'm going to put my declarations inside these squiggly brackets. And then I can just list my CSS rules as I want. So if we look at my slides, say I want to choose font, font weight bold, and we can see my page automatically updated. So it shows every single A tag on this page, all the length even down at the bottom, and it made them bold just like that. I can add a second one. If I want to italicize, it's called font style instead of font weight. And I can do italic, and we can see it italicize all of them. So that's pretty easy. We can just stack them as we want between this. We can do as many CSS rules on the CSS page. We just do a new line each time we want one. And we can even use A again. So we've put some CSS rules on A, but I'm totally allowed to select A again and apply some new things. So say I just write it again. It's going to change my font links like this. But notice what happens if I do the same exact thing twice, but with different values. So I've selected all links and made them red, and then I selected them all and made them green. And we can see only green is getting applied. What happens is at this simple level, we had the same thing kind of twice, just with different values. So if we have a conflict, the second one is going to take effect. CSS is read and applied top to bottom. So the machine, Chrome, is going to look at this one, then it's going to look at this one, then it's going to look at this one. So this is the last one it looked at. So it's going to overwrite this one. It's going to delete that and replace it with this value. But the best method to do CSS, since you'll have a lot of things in any given selection, my A, is to put each CSS rule on its own line. So I'm going to do A squiggly brackets, and then I'll put each one on its own line like this. So let's use font size. That's a good CSS rule to know. I'm going to say make all A's 18 pixels. That's pretty good. And let's go ahead and change font size again. But something we need to talk about is within any given CSS rule, in this case, font size, we also have different types of units. So not just different values. Obviously, with this one, I could do 18 pixels, then I could change it to 20 pixels, 50 pixels. But I can change the actual units that I apply. And a lot of CSS rules have different units you can choose from. So instead of pixels, I might do something called rem. And that just means it's relative to the root element. So the default font of the whole page, I'm saying make all links 0.9 times as big. So we can see when I applied that, this text now is 0.9 times as big as that. So what we've done is this one is kind of an absolute unit value, and this one is relative. And a lot of people who design in CSS, sometimes they use absolute, but a lot of the times they use relative to kind of bounce things off one another like that. One last one we could do 1.5 EM instead of REM like this. And now we can see if we look at this one and we can look at this one, it's not the same size. Even though I said all A's, change the font size to 1.5, something. EM just means element. What I've done is I've made it relative not to the whole page, that whole page default CSS, but I've made it relative to what's enclosing it. So if we look down at this, these lengths, it's 1.5 times the size of its enclosing HTML element. So it's 1.5 times this font size. But if you go up this way, this is 1.5 times the font size of, say, this box. So it's not relative to the whole page, but it's relative to its own little grouping on the page. So we can see it's a good idea to look at the different types of units you have available to you and pay attention to kind of absolute and relative sizing. Again, not specific to font size, but all kinds of things. You have lots of options with values and units. Let's do a couple easy examples again. This time I'll attack the P tags. So if we look at my HTML, let me get to my main page content, and we can see all of this stuff is enclosed in P tags, as it should be. So if I go to my P tags and some common CSS, we want to change, the font. So we can just type in the font name like that. We can change it as we want. A lot of the times you'll see something like this. And this is just something you'll have to get used to. A lot of CSS rules have its own little kind of value syntax. So with font family, you basically get to choose a font, but then you can specify a second font family, which is kind of the fallback. So this is basically saying, if I can't download this font, I'll just use any sans serif font. So that's what you'll see a lot with font family. Next, maybe we want a text indent. Let's apply this and see what it does. Okay, so it looks like all P tags, I indented, the initial line by 25 pixels. And if we look at this as we resize the page, obviously it stays at 25 pixels the whole time. That makes sense. But let's go back to that idea of different units and kind of absolute and relative. If instead of 25 pixels, maybe I'll do something like 5%. Actually, let me change it to 25. So obviously this isn't the same size as that 25 pixels, but also the main point is as I zoom it down, we can see the 25% is shrinking kind of like that. So this is going to make the font, the text indent relative to the width of my page like this. So this is still 25% of this width. Just like if I max out this page, this white space is 25% of this new width, depending on how we size the page. So just things to keep in mind as we think about values, lots of options, and lots of units to choose from as we decide how to make the page. One last useful CSS rule with text is text align. We can do something like justify, and then we can see we get justified font. Obviously, the second options we have would be something like right align, like that. We can do middle align, like this, and we can do left align. But as you can see, if I take this away, I still stay with left align. So that we can know is one of those default CSS rules that in this case, Chrome is applying to the web page. Left align is just the default. So we don't even need to specify it itself. Okay, so I don't need these examples. I'm going to delete these so you can keep them if you want. Okay, and then let's go back and talk about, as we begin to apply CSS to this page, let's look at the actual HTML and see how I made it so that we can apply some style to it. And I'm actually going to begin by going to a copy of this. This is what we'll make at the end of the day, actually. And what we can see is we basically have boxes of, I just put nonsense text in it, but we have like text on a page. We have multiple boxes. So what I want to think about now is how do we kind of box up content like this? Aside from even applying CSS to it, how do we define a box to begin with? Well, let's go ahead and look in the CSS. I mean, in the HTML. So we can see, we might know these things from last class. We have an H2. This is a heading level 2. Then we have some P tags. Each of these is its own P. And then we have some P tags with A tags enclosed. So we have some links at the end of each of these, little blogs or something. But then we can see these div elements, which maybe we didn't talk about so much last time. A div element is a meaningless HTML element. HTML is the language of meaning. But we have a couple elements that basically have no meaning. It's not actually giving out any meaning. It's basically just kind of a blank box, an open-ended tool that we can use to group a block of elements. And I know we said with HTML, we want to give a lot of things meaning so that the machines can pick up on the meaning and use things in specific ways. But at the same time, div, which is the meaningless HTML element, is one of the most common HTML elements used. So one of the most common elements of a meaningful language is a meaningless element, which is a little bit funny, but it's just a way of custom grouping things. So if we look again at this page, we want to somehow box up all of this. And if we look at this, we want to box up all of this. And we can see what I've done is I've put a div which wraps the whole thing around it. And I gave it a class called grid item. So I'm basically going to use this custom box, which all of this is nested in as kind of a single block. And I'm going to use that to apply my CSS. So let's go ahead and do that and see if we can get these boxes to show up on the page. So to begin, we have to select that box. So let me pull this down actually so you can see it. So let's go ahead and we want to select it, and I'll just teach you as you go. So we want to select div, so we just type that in. If we want to select a element with a specific class attached to it, what we do is we type in the element name like we did, and then we do a dot, and then we do the name of the class. So we could see this is yellow and this is blue. So this is basically saying I'm selecting an element with a specific class attached to it. So that's how we'll do that. and then a new CSS rule. I want to put a line on the outside of this, and we can just copy along as I go. So what I've done is I've applied a line to my element. It's 1 pixel wide. It's a solid line. I could have made it dotted if I want to. This is one of those things, again, when you have to look up the possible values that a thing can have. But I'll just give it to you now, and I made it black. You could have made this blue if you want. Could have made it red if you want. Anything you want to do at that point. So we can see we have a box on this one, and we've also selected all divs with the grid item class, and all of these have that. So we have boxes all the way down, exactly what we want. But then we see a bit of an issue at the bottom of the page. I just want boxes on like the main content, these little text posts. I don't actually want it on this contact thing at the bottom. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in the code, see what's going on. Okay, so I'm in the foot of the page. This is my contact stuff, and oops, it looks like I also enclosed this in a div with a class grid item. So that's why that's being selected, because that's exactly what I selected. And on a big page with lots of stuff, you might run into this issue. You select something, but you don't want to select all of them. You want to select like a subset of them. So let's go back up to this and see what we can do to just select these top boxes, but not this one. Well, one thing we can do with selection is kind of stack things. So I can say, not only do I want div with a class grid item, but I only want them if I can find them inside of a div with an ID of a grid container like this. So I'm just going to do div grid container like this. IDs get hashtags instead of dots like that. And we can see on my page, my box vanished on my bottom, and it stayed all the way up on these. So that's good. So what I've done is I've said, and we can kind of read this right to left. We can say, okay, I'm going to apply some CSS to all divs with the class grid item, but only if I find them inside a div with the ID grid container like this. So it's kind of increasingly specifying which subset of elements I want to choose like that. We can build these selections kind of as specific and non-specific as we want. So just as an example, and we could see this on my slideshow, if I do something like this, we can see this is selecting actually the same thing this is, but I just added a few things, and I can even add like body and things like that. But basically the point is I don't need these two things. I basically only need to select as much as I need to really specify exactly which elements on the page I need to. I don't really need to specify it's inside main, and I don't need to specify it's inside body, because I've already solved the issue of just choosing what I want. But you can stack those as much as you want. All you have to do is space out the CSS selection and just keep stacking things. So this just means all of these inside this, but I don't need that because it's not building a conflict if I do it this way. And then let's go ahead. I'm going to add a background to this. So background hyphen color like this. I'm going to use a custom one. This is just a shade of green using what's called a hex code. You could also, if you want, just type in green. That's a little heavy. You could, if you want, just type in light green. So you can kind of use these common names. But this way I get exactly the hue, the exact shade that I want this way. And again, all of these, both the names of things, why is it called this? Why is, how do I know between font weight, which is bold, and font style, which is italic? How do I get to all these things? Well, today I'll just kind of supply them to you. But we have all kinds of web tools that we can get to kind of see a full list of all the CSS rules available to us. So you can just kind of like study and scan these lists. A lot of the most common ones we'll look at today, you can just memorize them. But that's kind of the way it goes. You just have a huge supply of styles that you can choose from. And then within any style, you have a ton of options, values and units of those values, things like that. But as we can see, we could still kind of kept it the same from the beginning. We just make a selection, say what we want to style, and then the value of that style, just like that, and then it applies it to the page. So when we, chop off all the detail, it's still kind of quite simple at its base level. Next, so we looked at a few CSS rules to like kind of modify like the font. We did font family, bold, italic, font size, things like that. And that's all fine, that's useful. But one of the next big ideas in CSS is something called a box model. And the box model is basically an idea of how we should think of any element on the page. So any HTML element, these list items on this page, we can see visibly the element of the div with that class grid item. Each of these, we kind of put the box around and gave it this green background so we could see each of those as an element. So what is the box model applied to any and all elements? Well, it's basically an idea of like the shape and sizing and padding of any element on the page. How much space does it take up? Like the kind of the padding on the side, all that kind of stuff. So we'll just go ahead and apply the CSS to this, and then we'll see what all these things look like. So the inmost idea of the box model, inmost inside the box, is just the content. So we have the text and images. That is what we just call the content. So on this page, this is the content of this, box model of this element. The next thing, which we'll look at now, is what's called the padding. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to put it like this. So say I'm going to apply some style to the padding, and let me do 15 pixels. And now if we take a look at that, we can toggle on and off how big this padding is. So if I change it back down, we can see what the padding is. The padding is the space between the text content and kind of the edge of the box. So the line like that. So that's what the padding is on all sides. And we can specify just the top side. If we want padding on the top and bottom, but not the left and right, we can do that. We can do all kinds of things like that. The next idea in the box model, so we have the content, the padding, and the next thing we've already looked at, it's the line that encloses kind of the element itself. So that's that 1 pixel solid black line. And then the last thing in the box model itself is the spacing around the element itself. So if we apply 20 pixels margin like this, we can see suddenly we have 20 pixels between this element, AKA its box, in between that and anything else. So that and the side of the page, that and the next element. So that's what that one is. And if we toggle this down, we can see things just, touch like that if we don't apply a margin like this. And we can even do, if we take a look at this handout, we have all kinds of like ways that we can do the values. I said we can talk about like absolute and relative values, things like that. But we can also have these kinds of like abbreviations or like different ways of typing in the values. So instead of just typing in 20 pixels, which is saying put 20 pixels spacing on all sides, we can do like 20 pixels and 5 pixels. And then what that is doing, I have it in the CSS comment to the left. And by the way, this is a CSS comment. Just a slash and an asterisk, any comment that you want, and then an asterisk and a slash. If we take a look at the left, this is basically an abbreviation of saying 20 pixels top and bottom, and then 5 pixels left and right. And I can kind of exaggerate this so that we can see. I have 50 pixels on the top and bottom, but on the left, I have its own spacing, and that's just 5 pixels like that. And we can do all kinds of things. We can specify each one by hand if we want, like this. We can kind of do top, right, left, and bottom, each unique. Right now we have top and bottom and left and right defined because we have the top and bottom the same and the left and right the same. And we saw in the beginning, if we just have one, that's going to be the same on all sides, just like that. So this is also something you might see when it comes to CSS values. You might see like multiple values, and that might be denoting different sides of something like that. We can see with this guy, we have multiple values, and this is kind of like an all-in-one CSS rule. This is defining the width of this, the style of this line. So it's a solid line instead of like a dotted or a wavy line. We could get both of those options instead if we want. And lastly, we also define in this one CSS rule that it's black. And we saw that we can make it blue if we want. We can make it red if we want. So just something to keep in mind. The value of a CSS declaration could be a bit not complicated, but not as simple as you would think. So this is the box model. So we have content, spacing between the content and kind of its edge. And then we also have spacing between the box itself and anything else I want to touch. And we'll keep this on. I'm not going to delete this CSS as we continue to build up the page. Next, we'll take a quick dive out of CodePen. I'm going to go ahead and go to this website, and you can too as well. This is a little game that someone made. It's free on the web. And it basically teaches you how to make CSS selections. Let me go back to level 1. And we'll just do a couple levels so that we can see, get some practice, and then we'll go back into CodePen as we go on to like increasingly difficult examples. Not difficult, but just up from the basics. So we've done this a little bit. How do we just select an element? Well, in this game, we don't have like P tags and A's and H1s. We have like, this is a plate element. So it's a little, funny, but it's still exactly what we would do. So how do we select an element? Well, we just say it's element name like this. We select plate, and that's good to go. Again, we want to select the bento element instead of plates. So again, we can just type in bento, and we got that. And next, let's see, we want to choose the fancy plate. So we can see, what is a fancy plate? Well, it's a plate with an ID on it. So we want to specify, we don't want to just do plate, because then we get all plates. So what we can do is plate #fancy, and that gets that like that. We could also just do fancy like this, because as we talked about last time, an ID can only be used once on a page, and any element can only have one ID. So if I specify an ID, I know that I'm only choosing a single element with that ID. So I can do this as well as do this. If I add plate to it, it's kind of redundant. I don't actually need it. Next, we can choose things inside of things. We just did that a little bit with the grid items, but we can go ahead and do it again. What we do is we have all the lessons on the side of the page. We just put a space in between things. So we basically say, I want to select the apple on a plate. So I'm going to say inside plate, choose apple like that. Next, I want to choose the pickle on the fancy plate. So we can see a plate ID equals fancy, and then nested inside of that, I have pickle. So again, I'm just going to do #fancy. I don't need plate #fancy. And then I'll just say space pickle, and I get what I want. Next, I want to select the small apples. So we have multiple apples, but only a couple of them small, and that's denoted by a class. So let's do, we can just do .small, because we only have small apples on the page. So we can just do dot small. That's going to find all things with the class small. That's good to go. Now, in this case, we have multiple things with the class small, but we only want one specific fruit. So we can't just do dot small. We have to specify the element and then specify the class like this. We'll just do two last ones. Most of these high-level ones we won't need today. You can do quite complex things with selection, but we'll do these last two. So we want to select the small ones inside the bento boxes. So if we take a look at this HTML, let's see. So we want to choose the small ones in the bento. So let's see, inside bento, we want to choose this element if it's classed as small. So we just keep stacking things. And if we have a class, we can do dot small, maybe like that. And then lastly, we can do multiple things at the same time. So in this case, we want to select all the plates and all the bentos. That's not the same thing as all the plates inside the bentos. We want to choose kind of each of them separately, but we can do it on the same CSS line. So we can do plate, comma, and now I'm kind of choosing a new selection. And then I can just do bento like that. So I'm just choosing bento and I'm choosing a plate like that. So if you want to, at the end of today's class, when you go back to review, I definitely suggest, this is a fun little website to do. We can see we only got up to level 10 and we basically did all the basic ways of CSS selecting. All the ways beyond this, just show you how amazing CSS is, and that's why we'll stop now so we can stick to the basics. Now we'll get into a couple key CSS concepts. And the initial one is called inheritance. And this basically means that some CSS styling gets inherited. And that means all child elements of those also get the same styles. So basically what that is saying is, let's go back to this. What is a child and what is a parent element? Well, anything that's nested inside a second element is its child. So it's basically a way of saying nested inside of. So this image is nested inside of A, which itself is nested inside of nav. So this is a parent of this, just like this is a child of that. And it's basically saying, if we apply some styles to this, well, if the CSS rules that we choose get inherited, and some of them do, the styles we pick will also be applied to anything inside of it as well. So let's just go ahead and take an example of that to see what it means. I'm going to do the same thing again. You can see I'm selecting the same thing I did above. This one's kind of long-winded, but I'm just saying all grid items on the main page. And again, I'm just excluding this bottom grid item. So I just need this second thing just to exclude that. That's why we did that selection. So let's do something like this. We can change all the text to pink, kind of pinkish, salmony. And what we can see, let me find the HTML. Okay, so we've selected this div with this class, and we've applied this CSS to it. But we can see on the page, we also applied that CSS to this H2 and to this P tag and to this P tag, not to these A tags, actually. So it looks like the A tag is not inheriting those styles, but these ones do. So basically the point is inheritance lets you apply a few styles to kind of like the main box of elements, and then anything inside of that gets the same thing. And a lot of these tend to be kind of like text styling. So something like this, something like font weight, that's also like a kind of text styling. So we can see that also is inherited. And we can do like text align, also kind of a texty thing that also gets inherited. And we can see finally the A tag also accepted that as a child of grid item. So that's kind of the idea of inheritance. We can apply it at a high level, And then anything inside of that in the HTML also gets those stylings. Again, it happens with a lot of text stylings, but it doesn't happen with all things. And we can see that up in this actually. None of these got inherited down at the bottom level. And we can test that by saying, as an example, we only have this solid black line around the div with the class grid item itself, not anything inside of it. And we can test that by saying, okay, we have p tags inside of that div. So let's see what that would look like if we had this. And we can see if this didn't, in fact, get inherited, we would have all of these inlines as well in black boxes. We can apply that to the H2 as well. So you can see sometimes it's convenient to have inheritance. A lot of like text things, you want the text to be consistent across the whole page. So that's why we can do it that way. But some things we only kind of want at the one element that we apply it to. So this one doesn't get inherited. It's just applied at the one item itself. How do you know what does and doesn't get kind of passed down? Well, you just kind of have to get used to it. Maybe you look it up if you want to know. Just test it out anyway. You don't even need to look it up. Just do a little test and see what's happening like that. A next kind of main idea of CSS is something called specificity. And the question is, what happens when multiple CSS rules get applied to any given, the same element? Which one takes place if we have, like when in the beginning of the class, we had that A tag and we applied red font and green font to it. We saw in that case, green font was actually applied because it was the second one in the line. And we can see that on this. But CSS has a ranking system when things complicated to see what actually gets applied. We kind of give points on how we select things. And based on how many points something has, it may not beat out something, and it may beat something if it has a lot of points. You don't have to like exactly count up these points. It's just kind of an idea. So if we have a style attribute that has the highest specificity, so that's basically always going to win. So if I have an inline style on something, it's going to be quite difficult to subsequently apply CSS to it in, say, a page level style element, because that's not going to beat the style attribute. Likewise, if I apply some style to like just a p tag, but then later on I apply style to a p tag with a class of extra reading, well, that one's going to beat that one because it's 10-to-1 points. That's kind of the idea behind it. So let's take a little example of this. We can see in this example, if we have kind of equal selection, we just have an A tag and an A tag. They both have 1 point. So the second one wins. It's top to bottom like that. But let's do something like this. And let me show you what that is on the page. What I'm selecting is all of these links in these boxes. We can see in the HTML, I have a P tag, a class of extra reading, and then an A tag nested inside of it. So that's how I would select that. So let's apply some CSS to it. And then we can do some specificity tests. Okay, so we can see I took out, looks like I took out the underline using this CSS rule. And now let's do something else. Let's just specify A, all A's. And let's do the same thing. I apply it, and we can see these didn't change. And that's because this has about 11 points. If we took a look, a P tag, an element, that's 1 point. We have a class, that's 10 points. And then we actually have a second element, so that's actually 12 points. And then in this case, we just have an A tag, so that's just 1 point. It's less specific, so it doesn't beat out the previous CSS that we applied, even though it's second down on the page. So that doesn't apply to this. But if we take a look at the bottom of the page, we can see this does apply to the bottom of the page. And that's because I used the class on this, I wasn't actually applying any CSS to this. So this was unaffected by this. So it basically only saw this. It basically said, nothing has been applied to me. Oh, you want a blue dotted underline? I can do that because no one else has told me anything else. I didn't need to check, conflicts and specificity like that. These last two ideas, inheritance and specificity, they don't get too much in the way. It's something you'll see happen to you as you go along, but it's not too complicated. Most of what we just talked about is the whole basis of it, and you can just get used to it from now on. Next, we have two things. So if we take a look at what we just did, we said, he's got this blue underline dotted style because we didn't select it with this. But why didn't these ones also get it? Because if we look up in the HTML, we can see I have my navigation links, link 1. And this isn't inside a P tag with a class of extra reading. So this wasn't applied to it. So why wasn't this applied to it? Well, that's because it has a style attribute. It has inline style attribute. If we take a look inside this, we can see, oh, I've actually specified none on the underline to these links. So this has 1,000 points. So it's going to be quite difficult to beat it in this CSS style sheet because we could put an ID on it, we could put a class on it. It's still going to be way shy of getting 1,000 points. But we have one last tool that we can use, and that's just something that looks like this. If I add this to the end of any CSS value, it's basically saying this has the highest specificity possible. It's basically infinite. It beats anything that you can throw at it. So if I come down like this, the second time, and try to undo this, this is going to lose to this by an infinite amount because this says I have to take place. The only way we could beat it itself is if we used it against itself like that. And this is also how we beat the, obviously this is how we beat this 1,000 point specificity of the inline style attribute like this. So we can see a couple things. One, it's a pain to use inline style attributes. It's difficult to change them. You have to repeat it multiple times. So we'll just avoid that, as I've been saying. But a second thing is this is a useful tool to undo something that we can't really affect. But it's also difficult to undo itself without using this tool again. So basically what you want to do is I taught you this so that you know about it if you see it out in the wild. But basically you want to actually avoid using this as much as possible. You only want to use that if you absolutely have to make something take on a CSS rule like that. And then one last cool little selection thing is this not tool. So not basically deselects kind of like a subgroup when applying a style. So if we take a look at something like this, let's just go to all P tags. Let's say text align middle like that. Okay, that applies it to anything in a P tag. And we can also see it's inherited because it looks like it went to the A tags as well, all the way down. But say we don't want to apply this styling to these A's as well. If we look in my HTML, we just have a P tag with no class, a P tag with no class. So if we want, we could do like, we could add a class to it, class, example, but then we'd have to go back to all, 12 of these P tags in the HTML and add that new class like this. So we don't really want to do that because that's a lot of typing. So how can we, instead of selecting all of those, kind of deselect something from the general group? We can do something like this. We do :not, and then we just say not extra reading like that. So what we've done is we said select all p tags except when we find a p tag with this class attached to it. So we can see all these a tags which have that class to it don't get middle aligned, they stay right aligned like that. So that's a second kind of cool selection tool that we can use. Instead of specifying a bunch of stuff that we want to select, we can just kind of de-specify something that we don't want to apply this to using this kind of not tool like that. Next, we get into some kind of cool stuff with CSS. Everything we do now is kind of building on what we've done. It's just a few new tools and ideas when it comes to selection and applying things like that. And the initial one is something called a pseudo class. Don't get too caught up in the name because the next thing is something called a pseudo element. So don't get confused between pseudo elements, pseudo classes, elements, and classes. Just kind of focus on what these do. So what does a pseudo class do? Well, what is it? Well, it's a special state of an element. So we can think of it as an element state. And what is like a state of an element, an HTML element? Well, links have a lot of special states. They have a lot of pseudo classes. So one special state of a link is like if it hasn't been visited and if it has been visited. So sometimes when you click on a link on a website and then you go back to that list of links, the links that you've clicked on might be bold, might be italicized to show that you've clicked on it. So that's like a special state. When you click down on something, the active pseudo class, if I go to my thing, when I click down on this, we can see the blue changes to red like this. This is that active state. And then we have the hover state like this. And this one basically says, if I have my mouse above something, that state is kind of, that state is active. So let's apply a couple of these things and see what this does. I'm going to take these away as well. Okay, so let's take a couple of examples of these. And again, we'll just get used to kind of typing out CSS as we do this kind of long example. So what am I doing now? Well, I'm specifying these elements. I could put p.extra reading, but that's kind of extra data that I don't need. I don't have anything with the class extra reading that's not a p tag, so this doesn't really do anything. So I don't even have to put that. I'm going to take this one out too. Okay, so I'm right aligning these guys, and then let me do extra reading. I'm going to do some CSS to the link itself. I'm going to reapply this no line. Let me make it gray like that. And let me just change its font family. And like we saw previously, I can define a specific font, but I can also just define a font family. So serif, sans serif, and monospace is one. We can see it's kind of this Cody looking font. And now let's get into what a pseudo class looks like and what it does. So I got a pseudo class. So let's say I want to do something stylistically to these links when I put my mouse on top of them like that. So this is how I write a pseudo class. I just do colon and then the name of the pseudo class tagged onto the element that I want. And then we can say, let's say like font weight bold. We've seen this one. We've seen this one as well. Nothing has changed on the page. But when we put the mouse on top now we can see this effect. And we see these all the times on websites. When you put the mouse on something, you know, something changes, something grows, shakes. stuff like this. This is how you do it. It's quite easy, actually. We can keep going. Let's do a second pseudo class. So this is going to be an active pseudo class, is when something is being actively clicked. So let me say red. So now when I go back to it and click it, now it's red instead of, I don't know what it was. And we can even do some cool effects with these pseudo classes. So I'm going to say, select my grid item when I put my mouse on top of it, and then select my links. So what I'm basically doing is saying, select links inside this class, inside grid item, if my mouse is on top of grid item like this. And we'll see what it actually looks like when I put some stuff on it. So I'm going to say, let's change this underline. Let's change font size to 1.1 times what it usually is. And if we go back to the page, now we can see when I put my mouse on top of grid item, the A tag is selected and it has all these CSS styles applied to it. So when I put my mouse on top, it puts a line back beneath it and it increases the font size. And I still have these old effects. When I put my mouse on top of the A itself, I still change to bold and change to black from that gray. So I'm kind of stacking these up now. And I might do this so that when someone is navigating a page, when they put the mouse on top of a box, they get kind of a clue. Oh, hey, I'm just pointing out these links at the bottom, which is kind of like a visual cue thing, stuff like that. And then one last thing we can do is we notice this is a little spastic. It's a little quick, it's on off like that. But if I do something like this, this is called the transition, and it basically changes how fast something changes CSS. So I'm changing font size when I have my mouse on top of this, and it's basically saying take 1 second to change the font size. So it's a nice smooth change now. Not smooth on the way out, but smooth on the way in. But I can just go back to, let's see. I can put this on, I think this one as well. And now you can see when I just have an A tag without this hovering effect, it detransitions also in 1 second. So I had to put it on both sides of it when I go into it and when I come out of it. But now I have a really nice smooth transition, and that looks kind of cool like that. So all of these things I can just do. I basically just used one pseudo class to do most of these things. We looked at the active class, but this is the most common pseudo class you would use. When you have the mouse on top of something, apply a specific set of CSS rules to it. And then when you take the mouse off, those go away and you just have the basic default CSS on it at that point. So that is a pseudo class example. Next, let's talk about what pseudo element is. It's kind of the same idea. It's kind of like a special thing. A pseudo element, instead of a special state of an element, it's like a special component of an element. So it's not dependent on like the mouse and what's happening with that element. It's like a specific bit of that element. So a couple of examples, common pseudo elements. We might select like the initial line of something, like a P tag. We might select the initial letter of something if we want to do an effect like this, these kind of like capital things that you see in like old medieval books and things. And we'll look at these two as well. But let's do a quick example of these so we can see what that looks like. We move down my page, CSS comment, pseudo elements. And let's go ahead and with these ones, instead of a single colon, you just use a double colon. A little confusing, but not too bad. And just a new CSS rule, we can choose small caps. So if we see, I chose the initial line of all my p tags and I small caps them. So I chose this one, this one. I also chose these ones because this is inside of a p tag. So you know what, let me go back and use what I know. I know I have these not things. So let me deselect the class with the links. Now we can see I have small caps on just kind of these plain p tags, and I'm not choosing these special p tags that have its own reason to be. So this is the pseudo element bit of it. And the cool thing about it is we can see all of this is small caps, but if I change the size of the page, it's also gonna newly apply it. So it's always that top line that gets the effect like this. So if I shrink the page, we can see it changed it now. Just this is small caps and this is plain. So it's quite cool like that. A second example, we could do something like, let's do this little drop cap thing like this. So let's say, let's make it teal. Okay, yeah, we can kind of see it. That's cool. So we know it's selecting it. And actually, I only want the initial one. I don't want this second one. So let me stack something else on it and you can just follow along. Okay, so what I've done is I said, let me select all P. Let me choose in any group of P elements. So like this is a group of P elements side by side. This is a group of P elements side by side. In that group, let me only choose the initial one. So you can see I just have the teal L, this P lost this CSS. And obviously we still have this tagged on. So it's just applying this to the L like this. So I'm choosing just the initial P tag and just the initial letter in this P tag text. Okay, so selection aside, let's do some stuff like this to practice with some CSS. So see, I made it teal. What else can I do? Let me make it bold. Kind of jazz this up and make it look kind of cool. Let's change the font size. We can just do 2M. So that's basically going to say 2 times as big as its usual font size. So I don't even need to specify. I don't even know what size this font is. I can just say 2M, 2 element, and it's going to make it twice as big as that. Let me do something cool like a text shadow. And let me see. Let me show you what that looks like. This is basically a text shadow. You can kind of guess what it does. These values mean the X offset, the Y offset. So I'm going like out 3 pixels and down 3 pixels. The 1 pixel is like how fuzzy it becomes, like that. And then I just choose what to make it. And then something else you can do with the values a lot, you can sometimes stack them like this. So I'm actually going to apply 2 text shadows at the same time. Give me a second to type this out. And now we can see we have 2 text shadows. Let me toggle them on and off so we can see what we did. Basically, this is what I have with just the 1 text shadow. It's a little clumped up, but if I add kind of, this is the same green shade as the background. So I kind of add this spacing between them like this. So we can kind of see we got a nice little drop cap effect like that. And that's just to practice a little CSS and get an idea of what CSS can do like that. And then finally, just to wrap this up, we can do something like, we have padding, but we also have something that's specifically called padding right. So I'm just going to space out this. Let me toggle that off, just so we have a little space between it like that. So that's not so bad. And that goes all the way down the page, just like that. So a lot of cool things you can do with CSS. So you just stack up a couple things, and then you have a really cool like little project that we can think of, a little nice effect. continuing on with pseudo elements. Let's go ahead. I'm going to show you, maximize this. Yeah. So what we might want to do is, you see this little link. This is something we can do now using pseudo elements, and I'll show you how in a second. It looks quite complicated. We have this like thing popping out and the whole thing is moving and this is vanishing and coming into being. But really we can accomplish this with just like 7 lines of CSS and pseudo elements now that we know what that is. So let's see how we can make this in effect using these pseudo elements. So let's go ahead. Obviously, we have to select these links. So let's just say extra reading A, and then we have a new pseudo element. And this basically puts kind of like a pseudo element. It's like its own element just to the left of this element. And let me show you what that looks like. So if we do use the content and then give it a value, what this is doing is it's selecting all A tags in the extra reading class enclosed in that. And it's basically saying to the left of that, that's what this is. Oops. To the left of that, put the content, and I just put a little arrow. You can put anything you want, actually. You can put text, but we can see it applies it to all of these like this. So we could do that. Let me change this because as we saw in this, it's actually on the right-hand side. So we don't want this, but we actually want this. I'm just going to use this symbol at the moment. Actually, you know what? I'll go ahead and find it. I'm just going to look up a little text symbol. You can just use the arrow. Okay, so we can see, at least we easily accomplished putting the symbol on all of the tags at once because we used a pseudo element. But how can we get that little pop out effect like that? Well, one, let's style it as we want it to be. So maybe we want it to be red. And then let me show you how it was made. So we can see I gave this a margin on the left, but I gave it a -1. That's what I was saying about values. You have a tons of options to do values, different units. You can even go negative. So by negative, I basically pulled something into itself. Instead of having a spacing of 10, I had like a negative spacing of 10. So it's overlapping like that. Let me change. We have opacity as an option with CSS. I'm going to say 25% opacity, just so we can still kind of see what's going on with it. And then I just want this to be smooth, like we saw above when we had those hover effects. So I'm just going to say any CSS that changes, this is that all. Take half a second to change it so it's not so clicky, it's not on off. It's kind of smooth. And now we just have 2 lines left to make what we just saw. We have to make a new selection. So let's grab that class extra reading and grab that A tag. And now I want to change something. When I put my mouse on top of it, I want that to pop out like we saw. So we can see it's activated by a pseudo class actually, which is this pseudo class. But we still need to select this because we want to select that arrow itself. So let me show you the final product, and then I'll go back and explain it a little bit. So if I now say, when I put my mouse on top of it, add 5 pixels spacing in, we can see, oh, that's quite easy. I got that little jump out. Now all I have to do is just undo that opacity. I'm going to put 1.0. That's 100% opaque. Now we can see I got that like that. Now we can go back and just change this down like this. So that goes away. And now I still have my hover effect on grid item when I go in the box that pops out like that. And now when I put my mouse on top, I get my bold, I get my after pseudo element like this. So you can do a lot of cool stuff with just a few simple things. We know how to do this. We've seen transition. We just kind of have to stack up things in this kind of way. In the beginning, you won't be able to think of things this complex. It's good to just begin with the simple stuff, but it's also good to know what you can build up to. And it's good to just see a lot of CSS rules apply to anything so you know what exists. I'm going to skip animations just based on time, but I will show what you can do with CSS, so we won't take the time to type out the code. This is linked. This is like the final copy of what we'll be making today. It's linked down at the bottom of the handout you have. You can click this link to see this page. And we can see we still have, we have to kind of define what animation means in CSS. Obviously, we can see like movements with the hover root pseudo classes and things. But what an animation is it's kind of like a flip book. If we look at this little block of code, we can see we've used the animation CSS, and then we said which animation, do it in 2.5 seconds, do it infinitely many times, just keep repeating it. And then in the definition of the animation itself, I basically coded in like pages of a flip book. So in 2.5 seconds, at 15% of that time, I'm going to rotate Z along the Z axis. So basically I'm bending to the left like this and then joggling back like that. And basically I'm doing, so I'm just kind of like applying CSS to each second fraction of along those 2.5 seconds to build up to one effect. So each second of this login animation is its kind of own CSS, but I'm just kind of doing them in rapid succession like this. I'm saying toggle to the left, then to the right, then to the left, then to the right, and we can see this kind of joggle dance effect like this. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip that, but you have the full code and the code in the final copy. Just two last things that I want to talk about, just two last slides. One of the last key concepts of CSS is mobile responsiveness. Obviously, when you look at a website on a phone, you can access the same website on a phone and like a desktop PC, but it won't look the same. The layout is going to change, things like that. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So right now, if I kind of max out my page, we can see maybe if this is what my page looked like on a mobile phone, that would look good. But if I have someone who has a full desktop, this is a little stretched out. Maybe I want to put two of these boxes side by side like this, because we can fit multiple things across the page and we don't have to stack 6 items high. We could do like a box in a box, box in a box, box in a box. How do we do those things? And how do we detect which device someone is using to change that CSS? And if anyone has to go, I am videotaping this. So if you need to go, I know it's 5 o'clock. I'll be done in 5 minutes, but don't let me hold you back. I know I'm past time. So how do we do mobile responsiveness? Well, we can do it quite easily in CSS. We can see on this side of the page, I have my code. And with just these additional @media lines, I can basically control all the CSS that you would see on a tablet, on an iPhone, and on like a desktop like this. So let's just write this out kind of quickly. So it always begins at media screen, and then basically I'm defining a width of the screen of the device. Let me type this out and then I'll explain it in depth. So I'm basically saying CSS is going to pay attention to this rule, and anytime I change the width of my page, it's going to look back at this and say, is my max width 767 pixels? And things like that. Let's apply a few CSS rules and then we'll be able to tell. Inside these brackets, we can just do CSS as usual. Space this out. Oops, I always make this typo. Okay, so we can see. So I'm basically saying anytime my max width is, anytime my width is below 767, I'm saying the cap is 767. If I'm 767 and below, which is this point, I'm going to apply this CSS. So I'm basically changing the background of the page to this like pale pink when I'm at 767 and below. Well, when I come above 767 width, it kind of vanishes because this stops being applied. And basically the idea is we just stack a couple of these up based on how many devices we want to code to. Usually we do something like a tablet, a phone, and like a laptop or a desktop. And then we can define CSS to each of those specifically. Let me do this one, then I'll explain that. Okay, so now I'm doing my tablet. Let me see if I got it. Okay, yeah. So when I'm 767 and below, I have this pale pink. When I come between 768 and 1280, I switch to green. And then if I make my page big enough, I'm past 1280 and I lose both of those and I'm just white again because that was the default. And let me just add in the last one, that PC. This is going to be the biggest size. And basically we don't need the max width. We just want to say anything this size and above. So we'll say 1281. And I just kind of made up these device widths. But this is the idea. And I'm just going to put these all in so that we can see the change when it happens. Okay, so we have pale pink on the iPhone. We jump to green on like a tablet as we change screen width. And then when we get quite big, we switch to this kind of pale blue. And so now we can apply CSS to each of these devices basically itself. So we have to define CSS a couple times. Well, we could see we have a convenient place to do all of them. We just kind of space these out. And we could do some new CSS in each of them. And then the last slide today. So now we want to talk about layouts. If we take a look at the final product of this, we could see what we want to get to. Is we can see we change how these boxes stack up based on the width of the page. So we can see we go 3 side by side on a full desktop because we can fit that. If someone is using a tablet, maybe we'll just put 2 side by side so it's not too squashed, but not too much open space. And then if someone's on an iPhone, we can see if we go to this, it's getting a little squashed. So now we jump to just 1 on top of the second, and then it's just going to be a couple tall instead of squat like this. So basically we want to do some layout now. And layout is one of the most difficult things in CSS. It's like the most complicated, as you can imagine, from websites layout's not always easy. You don't always have just boxes side by side. Sometimes you have boxes not the same size as things. Sometimes it's not the same amount of boxes, not the same amount of height. But I'll go ahead and give you a quick trick to just doing some simple layout. So I'm saying I'm going to use the grid type CSS. What am I selecting this ID? Well, if I go up to my HTML, I can see I just have a second div, kind of just say me defined grouping of elements. It's basically wrapping all of these boxes, not this bottom content, but basically this box to this box. I have all inside of this. So I can use this as a nice selection tool to say anything inside of this is going to be display grid like this. And then what I can do inside of each of these, I'm going to select this again. And this is one of those CSS rules specific to a grid. And let me type it out and then I'll show you, tell you what it means. Okay, let's see if I did it correctly. Okay, good. Okay, so what I've done is I've said, let me take the parent element, which is this ID, which is wrapping all of these boxes, but nothing at the bottom and nothing at the top. I'm going to say anything in that its display type is going to be a grid type, and that's one of the main display types in CSS. I'm using my media CSS to apply a unique one at each screen width. And then what this line is I'm saying, basically I'm defining how many columns to have. And this auto thing is basically the width of the column. So this is my phone line. So when I say auto, I just mean fill it as much as possible. When I go to my tablet, I have auto. So I'm basically defining two widths. So I have two columns. And if I put auto, it's basically the same as doing something like this. This is auto as a width. So I could just do this too. But since I did auto, it automatically kind of does the calculation on my behalf. And we could see, now that we just realized this is the width, I can change the widths to be kind of custom. So I can do one at 25 and one at 75, and it goes all the way down like this. So that's not too bad to define the widths. And then on my last one, I missed one. When I get quite big, we can see I have triple autos, and that just means 3 columns, and each one is going to be the same width. So it's going to do the calculation automatically like that. And now we can see at the end, if I went back and fixed this, isn't that nice? Now we have a nice little web page. We have an iPhone, Android phone layout. When we jump to a tablet, we've changed the layout. That's pretty cool. And then when we go to like a big desktop, we also have a unique layout like that. We didn't have to redefine all the CSS, most of the same CSS, the text and the font family and the black and the link stuff. That's all going to apply to all the pages. But just when it comes to layout, we needed to change it in each kind of CSS size box. Let me label this as the desktop and this as the tablet like that.